Okay, so we're going to continue our story of looking at what happens when things in an equilibrium world change. So we were talking last time, we left off on how increases in supply work and tracing through some of how that worked. And so in this case we have, so if we have an increase in supply, so we walked through what happened when we had a change, something impacted demand, which caused us to move along our supply curve, which is a change in quantity supplied. But in this case, we want to look at what happens when supply itself shifts. And in this case, we're looking at an increase in supply. And so some of the things that can trigger an increase in supply are a decrease in production costs. So for example, if the main color additive, if the price of that goes down, then that would cause an outward shift of the supply curve. It was discovered that, for example, 50% of the Ronco color additive could be used by switching to a different filler deposition machine. Or Medicaid started paying for temporary hair enhancement materials. All of things that are going to lower costs and do some things to change things. So in this case, we have an increase in supply. And so what happens there is that the supply curve shifts out and to the left, and we're going to move down along the demand curve to our new supply curve. And so in this case, we would have a new equilibrium output quantity there, and we would have a new lower price in the marketplace down here. And so in this case, that's how we would move. So we go down along the demand curve to our new supply curve. So when we have something that changes, one of the determinants of supply changes, the entire supply curve is going to shift. And so in this case, when you have a decrease in production costs, or if you have an increase in supply for whatever reason, and nothing happens to demand, you're going to have a decrease in price, and you're going to have an increase in the quantity sold in the marketplace. Okay. Now, so some of the other things we can look at and kind of step through rather briefly are going to be like what happens when we have an increase in supply, or an increase in demand. So we have two types, just as we had before. We can have an increase in the quantity demanded, and so an increase in the quantity demanded would be reflected as a downward shift along the demand curve. And so and that's just looking at, if the only thing we're looking at is a price change, we're going to move down along demand if there is a decrease in price. So as price decreases, we're going to move down along demand, and that's going to cause quantity to increase. And you can see that as we move down along this curve, we're moving out along this way, and so that's reflected as higher levels of Q, and we have lower levels of P, price, because we're moving down along this way. Now, some of the things that can trigger that type of change are going to be, so for example, we have something, as we saw last time, where supply increases. So if supply shifts out, if we go from S0 to S1, we have an outward shift of the supply curve, and we move down along the demand curve to our new supply curve. And so that, in the demand side of things, is reflected. There's our change in price. Our change in price is the difference between the initial price and our new price. That's our delta px. And we see that the price falls and the quantity rises. And in this case, we had a change in quantity demanded as a result of a change in supply. So some other things that can happen in the marketplace. For example, so we have a supply increase due to a decrease in manufacturing cost, or maybe supply increase due to a change in government policy. So something that might cause an increase in demand is, for example, let's say the advertising happened to be really successful, and it was, let's say a study came out that showed that spray-on hair really increased dating success. And so what happened, so that would be something that would shift our demand curve out. And then let's say that Medicaid began covering spray-on hair for hair therapy, and this lowered costs to the consumers, which would be an effective rise in income, and basically makes the product cheaper. So that would cause an outward shift of the demand curve to D1. So let's say we started right here on our initial demand curve right here, and so if demand shifts outward due to any of the changes in the determinants of demand, and the changes in demand can be government policy, they can be income, anything but a price change, tastes and preferences, all those things are going to shift your demand curve. In this case, something that increased demand causes us to shift our demand curve out and to the right, so we then move along the supply curve. We have a new higher price in the marketplace, and we have a higher quantity demanded in the marketplace too. And so anytime you have an increase in demand, you're going to see an increase in price and an increase in quantity supply. So we can do the same game and walk through the same sets of things where we can have a decrease in quantity supplied or a decrease in supply. Now I'm just going to walk through the decrease in supply. So if this is our initial supply curve here, and let's say there's something that happens that causes our supply curve to shift, and we have a new supply curve here, so we have a leftward shift of the supply curve. So a left shift is equal to a decrease in supply. And so then we would move from this equilibrium point, we would go along the existing demand curve because there wasn't anything in our problem that said that demand changed. Now sometimes you can have a change in both demand and supply. And so again, the sequentiality is really important. So you move one, trace through effects there, and then move through the second one. And so always you go from, look at the change, and then you go to where you find the new equilibrium point, and it's always from equilibrium point to equilibrium point to equilibrium point. And so we have a new, we move along that demand curve up to the new supply. That allows, then from there we have a new, we have a different price. And in this case we move this way along the price axis. That's our quantity axis, so that's delta Q. And so this was our initial price, this is our new price. So we see that we have a new higher price right here. And so that's going to be our delta P, or a change in price. And we see that we have an increase in price, and we have a decrease in Q. And so when we have a decrease in supply, we end up with a higher price and a lower output, or a lower quantity demanded and supplied in the marketplace. So we can also look at how demand changes. And so we can have what causes demand to change. So some of the things that can cause demand to change are going to be, again, tastes and preferences, income, government policy, prices of other goods. So for example, so when we have a decrease in quantity demanded, so for example, so we'll start with, so if something changes in the supply, then that's going to be reflected as a change in quantity demanded. So some of the things that might cause that: supply decreases due to rising input costs, technology makes production more expensive, or let's say, for example, that the government forces removal of the polar bear killing ingredients, and so all of these things would be reflected as a decrease in supply. And a decrease in supply is reflected as a decrease in the quantity demanded, because what we're seeing is that the supply curve is going to shift upward and to the left, and that would go this way. And then, so as that happens, we have to move up along the existing demand curve. Now we can again have changes in demand. In this case, when we have a decrease in demand, so if we start at our original S naught here, and we want to look what happens if demand falls. So we kind of walk through this a little bit, but just to make it clear, hopefully. So if we have a decrease in demand, something that causes the entire demand curve to shift, so that at each and every price we have a different level of what's wanted in the marketplace. And so in that case, we would move along the existing supply curve to the new quantity demanded, which would be Q1 and P1. And so we would move from this initial P down to this lower P. That would be the new lower price as we go down this way, and we'd also move this way along the supply curve. So when we have a decrease in demand, we're going to have a decrease in the price in the marketplace, and we're going to have a decrease in the quantity in the marketplace. Some of the examples of what might cause a decrease in demand, you could have income falling, or you could have something like, let's say there's Jim Beam Company, and they begin advertising on a very snazzy infomercial a better and more date-getting version of spray-on hair, and it also happens to be cheaper. Or the price of or the price of cheap cologne quadruples, as does Budweiser, Coors Light, and a trip to the bowling alley. Under the theory that these are things that are sort of complements, and as we have more expensive things that you would have on a date where you might want your spray-on hair, those things become more expensive, your demand for the spray-on hair is also going to decline. So those are some of the examples that we could come up with. Now, granted, they're very silly, but okay. Okay, so as we think about how to work through some of the very tangled web of demand and supply and equilibrium, the basic steps, and they're always the same, and hopefully this helps you, and that's sort of the bottom line story that I'm trying to get to and showing how we shift the curves and what we do, is the first thing that you want to stop and think about after you've read the problem, or if you're trying to think about something like how the sequester of the federal government or cutting the federal budget, how is this going to change things for you? So what you want to think about is that there's an initiating event. So you have to think about what is the thing that they're telling you that changes. So you have some system in equilibrium, and then something changes. So you want to look at what is that change. And you want to determine if that event, that change, is going to impact demand or it's going to impact supply. And so basically you want to think about which side of the optimization or equilibrium problem is this going to be a problem for? Is it changing? So is that changing demand? Is it changing supply? Is it impacting costs? And that's something in supply world. Or is it changing something on the consumer side of the problem? So you have to think about which side, the benefits or the costs, are changing as a result of this event that's happening. And so then what you want to do is you want to change the first side of the problem, which is where it happened. So if you had something that changed demand, you want to look at, you change the demand first. And then you move to the next side of the market to find the new equilibrium point. And so that's where we're just kind of stepping through that. So if we have an initial demand curve and an initial supply curve, and something changes, and let's say the something that changed was a taste and preference and demand happened to increase. So then we would move the demand curve, and that's that second step. So we first determined what changed, and we say demand changed, and so then we change demand, and we move out to our new demand curve. And then we look at what we need to do to bring the market into equilibrium again, because we're going to move from one equilibrium point to another equilibrium point. So if this was our initial equilibrium point, we know we have our new demand curve out here, then we know that we have to move along this one to get to our new equilibrium point with our new price and our new quantity. And so we would move out this way and we would move up this way. And so those are the basic problem-solving steps. You identify what the change is, figure out what it impacts first, and then trace the rest of the events through. Okay, so when you're trying to solve these types of problems or think about this using an analytical framework of economics, basically what you're doing is you're always looking for where the two sides of the problem are equal. And you either do this graphically, logically, or mathematically. And the optimal allocation of resources occurs where the marginal benefit from any action is exactly equal to the marginal cost of engaging in that action. And when we set the marginal benefit equal to the marginal cost, we're maximizing our allocation of scarce resources. And this is basically saying that on the consumer side of the problem, the benefit side of the problem, we're getting the maximum amount of benefit that we can for our least amount of cost, and that maximizes our resource use. And that's where we want to finish off the story of equilibrium pretty much. And so just to summarize a little bit, this provides the best we can do because some of the underlying assumptions that we use to come up with that, or that we have, this provides the best we can do because of the utility theory that underlies everything. And one of the things to keep in mind that we've talked a little bit about, but not so explicitly within this, but in some of the other materials for the course, is we have this idea of $1 and 1 vote. So when we maximize the dollar value of something, we're maximizing the welfare to society. It's a very strong assumption, but it's one that we use, and it's part of the reason why economics is really the study of moral philosophy. And all of this that we talked about in equilibrium and in demand and supply, everything that underlies a lot of the standard economic theory that you're likely to encounter in anything below graduate school, is this concept of the economic man. And the economic man is rational, he can rank his preferences, and he's just this brilliant, rational, perfect thing that can always positively identify everything that he likes and why, and does amazing calculus in his head about prices throughout time. And in broad strokes, it works. Now, individually, it's a little bit ridiculous, but in broad strokes, it really works, and it kind of explains how price functions to bring everything into the marketplace. And it's because people, on the whole, even though there's some irrationality, generally do things in a pretty rational manner. It's also the idea of opportunity costs are embedded in this, that we need to be looking at what we do next. It doesn't really matter how we got where we were, we have to figure out where we're going from here. And that we have to incorporate, if I take path A, I can't take path B. If I spend my money here, I can't spend it over here. And we also have the idea of diminishing returns, so that the more I put into something, the less I get out of it, whether it's satisfaction or producer benefit, whatever it is. And equilibrium runs through just about every economic problem. And so anytime you're trying to solve something in economics, what you're really doing is looking for where things are equal. And that will wrap this one up. Thanks.